The trees in the park are starting to bloom. It's one of my favorite times of year. You know that either spring is here or it's right around the corner. It feels that way more and more every day. The days are getting longer, which is always nice. Uh, and it makes me think of all the cycles that we see day in and day out, year in and year out. Um, I teach math for a living, and so in Algebra 2 right now we're going over trigonometric functions and their graphs, and which are waves. And it's sort of a cool thing because you find it everywhere in science, these ebbs and flows, uh, not just the waves in the ocean, but light waves and sound waves and pressure waves moving through the ground. And even outside of science and economics, you've got the waves of the economy, the cycles, the ups and downs. And it's sort of everywhere you look, this feeling that when things are high, uh, at some point they're going to be low again. But when things are low, you know, those highs are right out around the corner. In medieval times, there was this idea of a wheel of fortune where when things were bad, you just sort of had to wait and eventually they'd get good again. Um, which is reassuring, you know, it's a nice feeling, and spring reminds me of all that. And I think to some extent, understanding these cycles is the foundation of civilization. I mean, you look at those oldest signs of civilization, Stonehenge always like strikes me as being extremely impressive, this monumental effort to be able to uh, measure the sky, look at the sky and see the changing of the seasons. And it's so foundational to an agrarian society to know when to plant the plants, when to harvest, what plants are planted where. And so the wise men of the past followed those cycles, followed the motion of the planets, the motion of the moon, the motion of the earth around the sun. Um, Not so much to understand it from a scientific point of view, but just to understand it in relationship to the seasons and the weather and what would be best for the crops. And soon, those people who were looking to the stars to chart out agricultural cycles, um, it sort of evolved into astrology over time, and this idea that in our own lives, there are cycles that follow the stars, that follow the planets. Um, and it wasn't uncommon at all. For most of history, the astronomers were the astrologers, and they would have side gigs. And so they would be, you know, staring through their telescopes at the stars, and then their day job was figuring out the future for the king, using the stars to make predictions for the king and the queen and their future, which I think is sort of cool. And some people still think that that's relevant, but it's definitely a huge part of history, this connection between astronomy and astrology. And there's all sorts of famous philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, I think Polonius is the guy's name. They believed that history could also be mapped out like the planets, of these long cycles, inevitable cycles of going from democracy to anarchy to sort of kings and queens, and so history would turn and turn, and you could sort of predict what was going to happen. And at any given point, you knew that change was on the horizon because history had to follow these same cycles that you could find in nature. And it was sort of seen as inevitable. And even today, there's all these different ways that we approach history. We think, you know, there's this pendulum swing when things aren't going our way. We think to ourselves, oh, you know, the pendulum is going to swing back the other way in time and things will return to normal. There's this phrase, there's nothing new under the sun. You know, even if history doesn't repeat itself, at least it rhymes. And there's this, this saying, those who don't learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. And this feeling that the history is sort of repeating itself, that things are inevitable, it's a very tempting feeling. Especially, I know for my own life, most of my anxieties surround what's going to happen in the future, what's going to happen next. And there's a certain ease, a certain comfort in being able to predict what's coming next, being able to say, oh, things are bad now, but it's just the way things go, and eventually we're going to get to this new spot, and it's sort of inevitable. And it's what I was thinking about a couple of videos ago. If Merlin is teaching Arthur, if Merlin is able to see the future, either because he's living backwards or because he's a prophet and a seer, is Merlin able to change history, or is history inevitable? It's one of those questions that I want to keep coming back to over and over again, because I think that it's a deep and profound question. And I think in White's The Once and Future King, there's a certain inevitability to history, in part because it's a legend, and I don't know how much artistic license White felt in deciding how the story started and ended, but it does start and end with war, and the knights are able to win at that war and establish the Round Table and establish justice and peace, but that Round Table always feels temporary. It feels like a passing sort of thing, and there's this certainty that at some point it will end. Even without Merlin's predictions, there's just this feeling that something like this, anything good, is bound to end at some point. For me, though, it comes back to agency. To what extent can we predict the future? To what extent is the future knowable? If history rhymes, how different is that from believing in the cycles of astrology? How different is that from believing that things are inevitable, that history is cyclic? And if it is, how does agency play into that? How do the decisions, how do the actions that I take have an impact if the outcome, the end, is sort of inevitable and knowable? There's something comforting in thinking that it's going to happen next, and it's sort of a hubris of knowing that you just sort of need to wait and things are going to turn out your way, that things are inevitable, and I really sort of push against that. And it's the sort of thing where once I noticed that people were doing that, and it's people from all sort of walks of life, and I also think that people go through phases themselves. Sometimes they think of things as going through these cycles, and sometimes they're feeling like their actions have consequences and things matter a lot more. But once you see that narrative out there of, there's a pendulum swinging and it's going to swing back my way eventually, or things are looking bad but they're going to get better, you sort of notice it everywhere. And you look for these patterns and the patterns pop out, which I think is why people like the idea of having cycles of history in the first place. It's an easy way of looking at chaotic events and trying to fit them to some sort of pattern that works, some sort of pattern that is, comforting and gets rid of the anxiety that's sort of inherent in the chaos. But I think it's a key question. To what extent is history ordained? To what extent is it out of our control? To what extent is it just going to happen no matter what we do? Like, do our actions have effects, or are things inevitable? I totally think that history is important to study. I think that you can only understand the present by understanding the past and seeing the patterns of the past. But I think that that's very, very different from saying that the future is inevitable and that things are cyclic and that we're stuck. And I want to talk about that a lot more. I think it's a good thing to think about.